Hello, Virgo. Let me say something before anything else. Something about the gap between what someone shows and what someone feels, because that gap is the central thing in this message, and I want you to understand it. Before I describe the specific gap that exists between this person's behavior toward you and what is actually happening in them about you right now, the gap between showing and feeling is one of the most confusing things. That happens between two people who have some form of connection and who are navigating what that connection is and what they want it to be, and how much of what they want they are going to allow to be visible to the other person in the real time of the connection developing, because showing and feeling are two entirely separate decisions made independently by the same person, and the relationship between them is not always what it appears from the outside. Someone can feel a great deal and show very little, not because what they feel is small, but because what they show is being managed for reasons that have everything to do with their own interior and not very much to do with the size of what they actually feel. Welcome, and let me show you exactly what is happening in this person's interior right now. While what they are showing you on the surface has been producing a very different conclusion in your own mind about what is happening, and you think they lost interest, I want to say that directly, because it is what you have been concluding based on the available evidence, which is the evidence of what they have been showing, or more precisely, what they have not been showing in the amount or the consistency or the quality of engagement and presence and reaching that you were hoping for, or that would confirm that the interest is still there in the form it was in, or in a greater form than before, as a connection that is developing tends to produce, rather than the reduced form that the evidence has been suggesting. You read the evidence and arrived at the conclusion that the interest is fading or gone or never was what you thought it was, which is the conclusion that the available evidence would logically produce in the mind of someone who is reading the surface of things and not having access to what is underneath. The surface of things is not the full picture. Whew. Let me tell you what is underneath. The interest is not gone. The interest has not faded. The interest has not become something smaller or less significant or less present in their daily experience of their own life than it was at the peak of what you were observing, when the surface evidence was more consistent with what was actually happening inside them. The interest has, if anything, grown in the inverse proportion to what the surface has been showing. The less they have shown, the more has been happening underneath. In the specific and particular way that feelings sometimes grow when they are being managed carefully rather than expressed freely, because the managing keeps the feeling in contact with itself rather than dispersing it into the expression and producing the particular relief that expression provides, which would have reduced the accumulated pressure of the unexpressed feeling that is now larger than it was when the managing began. I want to describe what is actually happening in them in the concrete and specific terms of their daily experience of you and what you produce in them, even in the absence of significant contact between you right now. You are present in their mind more than you are in your contact, which is a way of saying that the amount of time they spend thinking about you is not proportionate to the amount of contact they have been initiating with you or maintaining or allowing to develop in the visible and external form that you have access to. And that has been producing the conclusion that the interest is gone, the contact has reduced. The thinking about you has not. In fact, it has increased in the particular and uncomfortable way that things that are being managed rather than expressed tend to increase in pressure and presence in the mind, rather than decrease as expression would allow them to. I want to be specific about what they think about when they think about you, because the content of the thinking is as important as the frequency of it for understanding what they actually feel rather than what they have been showing. They think about specific things you said or did, or the specific quality of how you were in a particular moment that lodged in their awareness and keeps returning in the way that things return when they meant something in the specific and personal form of landing in someone and staying rather than passing through, and the way that most things do when they do not mean enough to stay. They think about what they would say to you if they were saying what they feel rather than managing the saying into the smaller and safer form. That has been all that has reached you. In the recent period, when what has not reached you has been considerably larger than what has has been accumulating in the interior of someone who is holding more than they are showing, for reasons I will describe. And they think about the specific version of a future that includes you in a form that is more than what currently exists between you, which is the thinking that only happens about people who are real to someone in the specific and significant form of someone who has gotten into the future version of how a person imagines their own life because they matter enough to be placed there rather than left outside it, in the category of things and people who were present but not significant enough to find their way into the imagined future. Now I want to explain why the surface and the interior are so different. In this case, why someone who has this much happening in them about you has been showing you so little of it in the form of the reduced contact and presence that has been producing your conclusion that the interest is gone because the explanation matters for how you understand what has been happening and what the gap between surface and interior actually means about this person and about what they are doing with what they feel, and whether what they are doing with it is something you want to engage with or not. The reducing of what they show came from fear, the specific fear of feeling too much in the direction of someone whose reciprocation of that feeling could not be guaranteed in advance of expressing it, and who might, if the full extent of what was felt were expressed, not feel the same, or feel it but not be ready for it, or receive it in a way that produced a response less than what was hoped for. I want to speak about this fear more specifically because I think naming the exact form it takes in this particular person will help you understand not just what produced the surface you have been reading, but what kind of person you are dealing with and what that says about who they actually are underneath the managing. The fear is not the fear of you specifically, not the fear that you are someone who would respond badly or unkindly or with indifference to what they feel. If they expressed it fully and openly without the management, that has been keeping the interior from reaching the surface in the volume it actually occupies. The fear is the fear of wanting something this much from someone whose response cannot be controlled or predicted or guaranteed in advance, which is the nature of wanting something from another person rather than from a situation or a circumstance or something that can be arranged or managed into the desired outcome without the vulnerability of another person's free choice being the determining factor. People are the one thing that cannot be managed into guaranteed responses. And for someone who feels this much in the direction of someone they cannot manage, the feeling itself produces a specific kind of alarm about the vulnerability it creates and the potential for that vulnerability to produce pain if the response they are hoping for does not arrive in the form they are hoping for it to arrive. That is the fear, the vulnerability of hoping for something they cannot guarantee from a person they cannot manage into a predetermined response, and the managing of their showing is the only control available to them in a situation where control is otherwise absent, is what produced the managing, and the managing is what produced the surface that led you to conclude that the interest was gone, when in reality, the interest was simply being protected from the exposure that expression would have required by someone who does not know. whether the exposure would be met with what they hope or with something that would make the exposure feel like a mistake rather than a risk worth taking. They have not yet decided that you are worth the exposure in the specific sense of having calculated that what they would receive in response to the full expression of what they feel would justify the risk of expressing it fully, not because they doubt you, not because they think you are not worth it, but because they are afraid of wanting something this much and having the wanting go unreturned in the form they are hoping for. I want to come to you now because you deserve as much attention in this message as they have received for what is happening in them. You have been reading the surface and arriving at the wrong conclusion, which is the entirely understandable thing to do. When the surface is all that is available and the surface is suggesting something, that does not match what is actually happening underneath it, in the interior of the person you are trying to read. I do not want you to feel foolish for the conclusion you arrived at, because the conclusion was reasonable, given what was available, and because reading people accurately when they are actively managing the gap between what they show and what they feel is one of the more difficult things that human perception attempts, and one of the things it is most likely to get wrong. When the managing is deliberate and sustained and competent, you got the surface right, you got the interior wrong. Not because your perception is unreliable, but because the interior was being actively hidden from the surface by someone who was motivated to keep the two separated for the reasons I described. I want to tell you what to do with this information. Now that you have it in the form that this message has provided it, because information about what someone really feels when their behavior has been suggesting something very different requires a specific response that is neither too passive nor too active, but precisely calibrated to the specific situation that this particular gap between showing and feeling has produced. The first thing, do not tell them what you know. Or more precisely, do not lead with the information in the form of telling them that you know what they feel before they have chosen to show it. Because people who are managing the gap between what they show and what they feel, for reasons of fear, need to arrive at the showing through their own process, rather than being pulled there by someone who has seen through the managing and is now presenting the interior before the person was ready to present it themselves. The showing needs to be theirs, or it will not feel like their choice. And the fear that is producing the managing will find a new form to express itself in, rather than releasing as it would if the showing arrived on its own terms, through their own decision to close the gap. The second thing, create the conditions under which the showing feels possible rather than risky in the specific ways that safety for expression is created between two people. This means being present in the genuine and unperformed form of someone who is interested in the actual person on the other side rather than in the strategic presentation of themselves as someone the other person should be interested in. Genuine presence and genuine interest in what the other person is and what they show, even in the reduced and managing form they are currently in, creates the safety that reduces the fear. That is producing the managing, and that allows the showing to approach the feeling more closely than it has been permitted to until now. And the third thing, trust your own worth. In this situation, which is different from requiring their showing as the proof of your worth or the evidence that what you feel for them is justified by their feeling for you. Your worth is not contingent on whether they show what they feel on the timeline that would be most reassuring to you, or in the form that would be most legible as the evidence you were hoping for, that the interest is still there and has been all along. The interest has been there all along in the form I described, large and growing and looking for the conditions under which the showing finally feels possible rather than risky. You thought they lost interest. They were drowning in it, and managing the drowning as quietly as possible so that the drowning did not become visible to the person causing it before they were ready to admit what it was and what it meant and what they wanted to do with it. Now you know what has been happening underneath the surface that was suggesting the opposite of what was actually true. Whew. I want to say one more thing before I close about what the gap between showing and feeling actually says about this person, because I think it says something important that you deserve to hear about the specific quality of what they are experiencing in relation to you. People manage what they feel when what they feel is too large to be comfortable with fully showing in the form it actually is, for fear of what the full showing would produce in response from the person the feeling is directed at. Small feelings do not require this level of management. Small feelings can be expressed in proportionate form without the particular anxiety of exposure that is too large. For the protection the management was designed to provide, what requires the level of management you have been observing is something large, something that the person experiencing it cannot afford to fully show, because showing it fully would expose them to a level of vulnerability that only very large feelings produce, and that only very significant people in someone's inner world make necessary to protect against The size of the management is the measure of the size of the feeling, and the feeling is large, larger than the surface suggested, by a significant margin that you now have access to. In the form of this message, rather than only in the form of the surface, that was providing the wrong information about what was actually there. What was actually there is large, and it is for you, and it is waiting for the conditions under which showing it finally feels possible rather than risky, not to expose or to force or to demand the showing on a timeline that serves your reassurance rather than their readiness, but to stay and to be present and to create the conditions under which what has been there all along finally arrives at the surface in the full and visible form of something that was always real and is now ready to be shown. Wait for it. It is coming